15 most dangerous prison inmates in the world. Prisons have always been designed to be brutal and horrific to live in. There's a lot that makes prisons so dangerous. Being raped by the staff, getting beaten up by guards at the slightest provocation, going mad because of long-term solitary confinement, or just getting killed off by medical neglect. But the worst part is, none of these things can compare to the violence that a dangerous prison inmate can inflict on you. And if you happen to be sharing a cell with one of these prison inmates, you'll be left to the dogs to die. In this video, we're giving you a roundup of 15 most dangerous prison inmates that will make you feel so much luckier to be on the outside of prison walls. Before we continue, make sure to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for notifications. Let's begin. 15. Robert Maudsley. Robert Maudsley was a troubled boy from Liverpool. By the age of 21, Maudsley had to turn to prostitution to support his drug addiction. In 1974, he was picked up by a man named John Farrell in London one night. The man proceeded to show him pictures of young children that had been sexually abused by him. Maudsley snapped and within a few minutes managed to strangle him to death with a wire. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder and placed in a psychiatric facility. 3 years later, in 1977, he and another inmate locked themselves in a cell with another prisoner, David Francis, and tortured him for 9 hours before killing him. Maudsley was charged with manslaughter and had to be transferred to Wakefield Prison. 1 year later, in 1978, he lured fellow inmate Sawney Darwood to his room, where he strangled him to death and stuffed him under his bed. He wasn't done, though. He wanted to squeeze in one more murder before the day ended. He tried luring other inmates from his wing, but they all refused, so he took a walk to the other wings instead. Eventually, he found Bill Roberts. He lunged at Roberts with a dagger he had made and stabbed him in the head repeatedly and killed him by smashing his head into the wall. After he was done, he picked up the dagger, went over to the prison officer, and calmly told them that 2 people would be short in the next head count. It was rumored that he had eaten the brains of one of his victims, giving him the nickname Hannibal the Cannibal. In 1873, the officers considered him to be too dangerous for a normal solitary cell, so they made a 5x4 cell out of bulletproof glass in the prison's basement and transferred him there, where he has been serving his life sentence for the last 47 years. 14. Joachim Kroll, Maneater. Kroll killed his first victim at the age of 22 after he was triggered by his mother's death in 1955. He started with 19-year-old Irmgard Strell, a girl who he raped and stabbed to death. He disemboweled her body and left it in a barn in Ludinghausen, Germany. Every year after that, he raped, killed, and dismembered his victims, often raping them after they had died too. In total, he killed 14 people. Most of his victims were aged around 12. The youngest one was 4 years old, whose body played a part in his eventual arrest. On the 3rd of July, 1976, Kroll's neighbor noticed that the waste pipe of the apartment building was blocked. When he asked Kroll if he knew what was causing the blockage, he replied guts. This alarmed him, and he immediately called the police and told them what Kroll had said. When they got to his apartment, Kroll was in the process of cooking some of the body parts of the 4-year-old and found the rest of her body in the refrigerator. He confessed to the murders and said that he'd eat the flesh off of the bodies later to save up on his grocery bill. In April of 1982, he was sentenced to 9 life sentences after being convicted for 8 murders and spent the rest of his life in Rheinbach prison until his death in 1991. 13. Michael Parr and Nathan Mann. Michael Parr was being treated at a mental hospital in 2003 when he tried to kill another patient. He was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. That's where he met Nathan Mann, who had been arrested after he broke into a nursing home in Leicestershire in 2007 by climbing in through the window into a room and killing 2 women, aged 73 and 56, who lived there. Mann was sentenced to serve 24 years in prison. The 2 met at Franklin Prison, County Durham, where they bonded over their mutual interests. On October 1st, 2011, the pair decided to strike inside the prison walls. They picked 23-year-old Mitchell Harrison, who had been incarcerated for raping a 13-year-old girl and was serving an intermediate sentence, tricked him into coming into Mann's cell, where Mann held him down as Parr took a scalpel that he made using plastic cutlery and sliced open Harrison's neck. Then they stabbed him in the eye with a pen, which they thought would be enough to kill him, but it didn't. Instead, Harrison struggled even more, while Parr and Mann took it further by cutting his stomach open and disemboweling him. The two confessed that the plan was to remove his liver and eat it, but they couldn't go through with it. The two then decided to have a smoke and a cup of tea before they asked for the door to be opened. Then they both went to the senior officer and confessed to the killing. Parr was sentenced to serve an additional life sentence with a minimum of 32 years, while Mann received an additional 16 years that would begin once his original 24-year sentence is served. 12. Roch Thériault. Roch Thériault was born in 1947 in Quebec, Canada. In the 7th grade, he dropped out of school and started teaching himself using the Bible. By the late 1970s, he managed to rope a few people into following him and his religious movement and formed a cult named the Ant Hill Kids. The members of the cult were not allowed to have any contact with their families, saying that if they did, they'd be going against the values of the cult. He made himself out to be a man sent from God, telling his followers that the end of the world was coming. To grow his followers in numbers, he married and impregnated all of the 9 women in the cult. By 1980, the membership had grown to 40. He would subject his followers to brutal punishments if they didn't follow his rules. These punishments included him suspending the followers from the ceiling, forcing them to break their own legs, sit on a lit stove, eat dead mice and feces, and even shoot each other in the shoulder with no access to medical care. Over time, his obsession got worse. He started doing self-taught surgeries on his followers. In 1989, Solange Bollard told him she had an upset stomach and that she was in pain. He had her lay naked on the operating table, punched her in the throat without any anesthesia, cut open her stomach, and disemboweled her with his bare hands, had an assistant put a tube down her throat and blow air into it, leading to her death. He then claimed he had the power of resurrection. In order to bring her back, he drilled a hole into her skull and proceeded to ejaculate in it and had other male members do the same. 2 years later, another member named Gabrielle Lavaille was brutally punished by him. When she tried to get medical attention, he amputated her arm using a chainsaw. This was when he was arrested and sentenced to 12 years behind bars. Lavaille further exposed him for his crimes, and in 1993, he pled guilty to the murder of Bollard and was sentenced to life in prison. He tried to appeal for parole, but was rejected because the judge considered him too high risk to ever let him out again. 11. Robert Stroud, Birdman of Alcatraz. Robert Stroud was only 13 years old when he ran away from home in 1903. By the time he turned 18, he was already an established pimp in Alaska. In 1909, he got into a fight with someone that had assaulted one of the girls that worked for him. Stroud knocked him to the ground and shot him at point-blank range while the man was unconscious. He then took the gun and handed it over to the police, confessing to the murder. He was arrested and sentenced to 12 years in the federal penitentiary on Puget Sound's McNeil Island. There he captured and studied over 300 canaries over the years, even wrote a book on them, giving him the name Birdman. Stroud was known as the most violent inmate in the entire prison. He stabbed an inmate for telling on him for stealing food from the kitchen, and another for not cutting him in while he smuggled drugs across the prison. He also got into a physical altercation with a hospital orderly when he refused to give Stroud extra morphine. Stroud got an extra 6 months added to his sentence for the attacks and was transferred to the Leavenworth, Kansas Federal Penitentiary. In 1916, he was just about to get visiting privileges back when he was caught breaking a minor rule by prison guard Andrew F. Turner. Stroud didn't want to forego the chance of seeing his brother, so he stabbed Turner in the heart using a 6-inch shiv. He was convicted for the murder and got a life sentence added to his overall sentence. He ended up spending the remainder of his life in solitary confinement and died in 1973 at the age of 73. 10. James Demouche. On October 17, 1976, James Demouche was 22 years old when he and his brother Christopher decided to rob their local Pizza Hut. In the robbery, James shot 19-year-old Scott Sorrell and 20-year-old Robert White, the last 2 workers who were closing up with the manager for the night. Sorrell was still alive after the first shot, choking on his own blood. When Demouche heard the choking, he shot Sorrell again to make sure he was dead. The manager was shot as well, but he pretended that he was dead by falling over. Demouche went to shoot him again too, but realized he had run out of bullets. He survived the attack and testified against the Desmouches brothers. Christopher couldn't deal with the guilt and surrendered himself the next morning and gave a written statement detailing everything that happened, implicating James as well, who was arrested from his home the same afternoon. Both brothers were arrested and convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life. While in prison, James got the nickname Meanest Man on Death Row. He would repeatedly get into fights, had set his room on fire multiple times, destroyed TVs and toilets in the wing, and even threw lye at a guard's face because he wanted to steal his phone. In 1983, he killed another inmate by stabbing him 27 times and slashed open the chest of a prison guard as he brought food for him. He had also raped and beaten at least 2 other inmates during his time. All this led to him being locked in isolation for the remainder of his sentence. He was executed by lethal injection on September 22, 1992. 9. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer was popularly known as the Milwaukee Cannibal. In 1978, Dahmer was 18 years old when he picked up a hitchhiker, 19-year-old Stephen Hicks, and lured him back to his home, saying the two could hang out and have drinks together. When Hicks wanted to leave, Dahmer hit him in the head with a 10-pound dumbbell repeatedly until he got disoriented and sat down. He then strangled him using the bar of the dumbbell. Dahmer cut the body into pieces and buried it in his basement for a few days, dug the pieces back up and separated the flesh from the bones, dissolved the flesh in acid and flushed it, crushed up the bones using a sledgehammer and spread the pieces into the woods behind his home. From then to 1985, Dahmer was arrested numerous times for drunken disorderly conduct, indecent exposure, and other small crimes. This was around the time when Dahmer started frequenting bathhouses. He'd take part in sexual encounters while he was there, but had an issue with his partners moving during the encounter, so he started drugging them and raping them while they were unconscious instead. Over the course of the next 10 years, he lured many men into his home and hotels and drugged, raped, and murdered them, disposing of their bodies the exact same way as his first kill. His final victim would have been Tracy Edwards, a man he paid $100 to pose for nude photos for him. When Edwards got there, Dahmer handcuffed him, put his head on his chest, and said he wanted to hear his heart beating because he was going to eat it later. Edwards managed to distract him long enough to kick him in the head and run out the door, where he flagged down the police and took him back to the house. The police went through his house to find multiple severed heads, skulls, various body parts chopped up, torsos and human organs in the freezer, and Polaroids documenting several human bodies at different stages of dismemberment. The police officer said it was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene. Dahmer was sentenced to 941 years in prison. There, he'd frequently shape food into the shapes of human body parts, would cover them up with ketchup to resemble blood, would threaten other inmates and guards and tell them he'd eat them, and terrorized everyone until he was killed in an altercation on November 24, 1998. 8. Richard Loeb. Richard Loeb and Nathan Leopold were 2 brilliant students who had graduated from the University of Michigan at the ages of 17 and 18. They were so egotistic about how smart they were that even though they belonged to wealthy families, they wanted to commit the perfect crime because they thought they were so intelligent no one could ever catch them. The 2 rented a car and drove around Chicago until they found the perfect victim, 14-year-old Bobby Franks. They picked him up, knowing that his father is a wealthy man, killed him by repeatedly stabbing him with a chisel in different parts of his head until he bled to death, and burying his body a few hours away from the city in an old railway culvert. They then contacted Frank's parents for a $10,000 ransom, but were shocked when the police discovered his body and Leopold's glasses that led them straight to them. They were both arrested shortly after and sentenced to life in prison. Loeb was considered a dangerous man and a sexual predator even inside the prison walls, even though no conclusive evidence was ever found. He got into numerous altercations, and before he could be separated from the general prison public, he was killed by another inmate for allegedly trying to engage in a sexual encounter in 1936 at the age of 30. 7. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was one of the most dangerous men America has ever seen. He was commonly known as Pogo the Clown and would perform at children's birthday parties. Using the friendly clown persona, he'd lure young boys back to his home, where he'd have them do a trick that involved him putting handcuffs on them. Then, he'd rape and kill them by strangling them to death with a wire. He continued to do this all throughout the 1970s. He would then put the bodies in sacks and bury them in the crawl space underneath his house, around the house, or dump them in the river. In December of 1978, he confessed to his lawyer while he was drunk that he had killed a boy that the police had been looking for, telling him that he's in the river. This led to the insurance of a search warrant against him when the police got to his house. They found the crawl space was flooded. They drained out the water and started searching. They came upon ribs, skulls, and dismembered rotting body parts. There were remains of 26 boys in that crawl space. Another body was buried under his garage, more on the outskirts of the property, and 4 in the river. He had killed a total of 33 boys. 12 of the victims died of suffocation because they had cloth lodged into their throats. Some were stabbed to death, and others still had ropes around their necks when their remains were found. He was given 12 death sentences and was killed via lethal injection on May 10, 1994. 6. John Dillinger. John Dillinger was one of the biggest names in the 1900s. He was in and out of prison for being part of at least 12 armed robberies at various banks. On his first one, he managed to steal over $10,000. He was arrested on August 14, 1933, and taken to Allen County Jail in Lima to wait for his court hearing. Before he was led into prison, he was searched and the guards found what looked like an elaborate prison escape plan. When he was asked to tell them what it really was, he refused to talk. Turned out, Dillinger had his contacts smuggle guns into the laundry room where he and 6 other men worked at. Together, they all made a grand escape. In 1934, he and his gang were arrested again after being caught in Tucson, Arizona. They were escorted back to Indiana to Crown Point Jail. The officers boasted about the fact that they had caught an escapee and said that this jail was escape-proof and that they had him for good this time. Dillinger outsmarted the guards by pretending that a piece of wood was a gun, put it on the officers' necks, and locked them all up in a room. He walked out of the prison and even stole the sheriff's car to drive away. 5. Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei Chikatilo is better known as the Butcher of Rostov. He was born in Ukraine in 1936 when the country was going through one of the worst famines in history. His mind was severely affected by the traumas he saw when he was growing up. By the time he was in high school, he released that he has erectile dysfunction, which triggered intense anger and frustration in him. When he was in high school, he forced himself on to an 11-year-old girl and ejaculated before they even hit the ground. This experience made him an even bigger target for the bullies at his school. Tired of being bullied, he moved to Russia, where he married a local girl after knowing her for only 2 weeks. The couple had 2 kids together while Chikatilo got a job at a mining school near Rostov. On September 3, 1981, Chikatilo got his first murder victim, 17-year-old Larisa Kachenko. He took her into the woods, choked her by stuffing dirt into her mouth, strangled her, and stabbed her to death. He said that was the first time in years that he had felt true sexual satisfaction, saying that he could only feel that way after he killed someone. He went on to kill another 50 people over the next 25 years. He'd mutilate his victims' bodies. His signature was that he'd cut out the victims' eyeballs, allegedly also ate some of the genitals of his victims. The police finally arrested him for 36 murders in 1990, but he confessed to having killed 56 instead. He was convicted for 53 of them and was given the death penalty. He was too dangerous to keep around in the regular prison, so he was executed by being shot in the back of the head on the 14th of February 1994, which was the earliest date they could execute him on. 4. Albert Fish. Albert Fish was born in the U.S. in 1870. He was taken into the foster system, where he says he saw things that he didn't want to see. He was traumatized, and that led to becoming a sadomasochist. By the age of 12, he was repeatedly poking needles into his groin and hitting himself with a paddle. He eventually moved on from hurting himself to other people. He moved to New York and started luring young boys into his home in order to rape and torture them. By 1898, he was married to a woman and the two had 6 children together. While he kept his own kids away from all harm, he raped and tortured all the other children he can get his hands on. On May 25, 1928, Fish read a newspaper ad where an 18-year-old was looking for a job. He decided that he was going to be his next victim. When he went over to meet him, he saw his younger sister, 10-year-old Grace Budd, and he decided to switch his next target over to her. Fish took her from her home under the false pretense of going to his niece's birthday party with him. Instead, he took her to his house. He undressed so he wouldn't ruin his clothes with blood. What he did after, he penned down in a letter he sent his mother. It said, "First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her into small pieces so I could take the meat to my room, cook, and eat it. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body." The paper used to write the letter was used to track down fish, and he was caught on December 13, 1934. He was convicted for 3 of the murders he committed while he had claimed over 100 and was sentenced to death and was executed by electric chair on January 16, 1936. 3. Marcos Williams Camacho is well known for being the leader of Brazil's most organized criminal organization, the PCC. In July 1999, his gang pulled off the biggest bank heist in the history of Sao Paulo, getting away with 32 million Brazilian reais. Within the next 3 weeks, Camacho blew a lot of money on the luxury cars and on other things. He was spotted in one of his imported cars and arrested. He was sentenced to 232 years and 11 months for drug trafficking and smuggling, murder, organized crime, money laundering, bank robbery, and terrorism. But he was far from being done. In 2001, he managed to start 29 prison riots and was responsible for the murder of Judge Antonio José Machado Diaz. In May 2001, he found out that him, along with 700 other inmates, were being moved to a maximum security prison. Camacho called for reinforcements from the PCC and organized a series of attacks on the Brazilian police, which eventually led to the Sao Paulo violence outbreak, which was considered the most violent attack in Brazil's history as it resulted in over 150 deaths in a single night. To put it into perspective how much power he had, even behind the walls of prison, he said in an interview in 2014, "It is you who are afraid of dying, not me. As a matter of fact, here in jail, you cannot come in and kill me, but I can order to kill you out there." 2. Alexander Pichushkin. Alexander was born on April 9, 1974. By the time he was 18 years old, he had already committed his first murder by pushing a boy out of a window. While describing the murder in an interview, he said, "The first murder, it's like first love, it's unforgettable." He didn't kill again until the early 2000s. In the Moscow Betsevsky Park, he would lure his victims in by asking them to come drink with him at his dog's grave. He'd then hit them with whichever blunt object he had brought with him that day, usually a hammer or a pipe, and would throw their bodies into the sewer nearby. Over time, he started to care less and less about being clean with the murders. He had left a few bodies with broken vodka bottles sticking out of them. He wouldn't even dispose of them. He'd just leave them out in the open to be found. He was caught when he claimed his last victim's life. A woman he used to work with. She had left a note to inform her son that she was going to take a walk with Alexander, only to be killed by him. The police arrested him shortly after the murder. When the authorities were searching his house and other belongings, they found a chessboard with dates written on 62 out of the 64 squares, each corresponding with the murder he'd committed. His goal was to kill at least 64 people to fill up an entire chessboard, which was why he was rushing through them. He was convicted for 48 murders and sentenced to life in prison. Notorious for one of his lines while describing why he kills in an interview, he said, "For me, a life without murder is like a life without food for you." 1. Thomas Edward Silverstein. Thomas Edward Silverstein was born in Long Island, California in 1954. In 1971, he was arrested for the first time for an armed robbery but was released on parole 4 years later, only to attempt another robbery and land back in prison shortly after. 6 years after his first arrest, Silverstein was sentenced to 15 years for his crimes, but he was just getting started. In 1980, Silverstein killed a fellow inmate when he refused to be his drug mule while being moved to another prison. A year later, he was accused of killing another inmate named Robert Chappelle. Silverstein denied these allegations but was still convicted and received an additional life sentence. This was when the prison guards transferred another dangerous inmate, Raymond Cadillac Smith, who wanted to avenge Chappelle's murder, to the same unit as Silverstein. The two got into a fight, and Silverstein killed Smith with the help of another inmate by stabbing him 67 times using a homemade shank. He then dragged Smith's body all around the prison, up and down the stairs, and in front of all the cells to show the other prisoners what he had done. This got him another life sentence. In 1983, he was let out of his cell to shower when he killed correction officer Merrill Klutz by stabbing him dozens of times. Silverstein was moved to permanent solitary confinement with no human contact, where he stayed for 36 years, the longest anyone has ever been held in solitary in America until his death on May 11, 2019. That's a wrap for the 15 most dangerous prison inmates in the world. Which one of these are you most terrified of? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this.